Hey grade 11s, so today we're going to really start getting into the digestive system and the digestive tract. So we'll just start off talking about what the digestive tract is. It's a large tube that begins with the mouth and ends with the anus. The main function of the system is to ingest food, digest the nutrients so that those nutrients can be absorbed. Tongue twister for me apparently. And then it eliminates any indigestible materials, so anything that you cannot break down in your body and cannot be absorbed in your body gets expelled. So today we're going to look at the structures. So this is a lot of things that you need to copy down. We're going to take these one step at a time. So I know this is kind of an overwhelming diagram, but we're really going to break everything down. So we'll just go over it quickly here. So lots of these structures we've kind of already talked about when we looked at the respiratory system actually. So this is the pharynx, which we talked about as the throat, right? And we remember that air and food both go through the pharynx. We have a couple of different structures in here. We have our epiglottis here that's going to cover the trachea and larynx so that we don't get food into our windpipe. Those aren't on this diagram just because you've already done those before, so I'm assuming you remember the epiglottis and the uvula in terms of where they are. Here we have the mouth. Unlike the airway, where we had air that could enter either through the mouth or through the nasal cavity, food can only enter through the mouth. I know that's probably self-explanatory, you don't eat through your nose, but just to remind you, the mouth is where food enters the body. We have the tongue here, which will help to move food around, help with mechanical digestion of the food, and then help push food down into the esophagus. These big chunks here are the salivary glands, so those are what produce the saliva. And we're going to talk about all of these, everything in here, in more detail in terms of function, just little bits at a time, so this is just a brief overview. So anyways, after we have this, we go to the pharynx and then into the esophagus, this long tube, which is where the food travels down until it can reach the stomach here. Okay, this big chunk is called the liver. So it's resting just underneath the diaphragm. I have this one blocked out. You don't need to fill in the diaphragm. You know what that is, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the digestive system. It's just on our diagram here to give you a frame of reference. So anyways, we have the liver here, stomach here. This is the gallbladder, which is attached to the surface of the liver. And these kind of work together in our digestive system, which we'll talk more about later. This object here, kind of underneath the stomach, is the pancreas. This was blocked out as well. It's talking about the specific little, I think it's the vein or artery that's on there. You don't need to worry about that. We're not going to get into the pancreas in that much detail. But anyways, so again, this is the stomach, the liver, the little gallbladder, and the pancreas. This big wavy tube here, all in the middle, this is the small intestine. We also have, we have the common bile duct here. This one, don't worry too much about. This is just how bile gets into the small intestine, which again, we'll talk about later. So that's why common bile duct is there, and that's right here. So anyways, this is the small intestine. That's kind of all squiggly up in here, and it starts here. There's this branch of the small intestine. This part right here, right from the stomach, is called the duodenum or the duodenum. So I usually say duodenum. Obviously, I have a hard time saying duodenum, but anyways, you can say it either way, whatever's up to you. So that specific part of the small intestine. The rest of this is other parts based on this diagram. So this is all small intestine in here. After the small intestine, we come to the large intestine, and this is where the entry into the large intestine is. This bottom part is called the cecum. And then it has the variform appendix here. Usually we just call that the appendix. So if you've ever heard of appendicitis, it's this little guy right here below the cecum. And so there's a space. This is where the small intestine enters the large intestine, and the cecum is the part below the entranceway. So this part of the large intestine is the cecum, this is the appendix. Coming up this way, we have the ascending colon, part of the large intestine. This part across here is the transverse. So we have our transverse colon here. Right here is the descending colon, and again, this is all part of the large intestine, so this is the descending colon. Comes all the way here. This little branch across right here is the, and into here is the sigmoid colon, and then here's the rectum, and then you can either label this as anus or anal canal, it's up to you. So again, there's lots of parts of the large intestine, lots of different parts of the colon, but ascending, transverse meaning across, descending, those are pretty simple to remember. This is the kind of tricky part down here, is to remember that the part below the entrance of the small intestine is the cecum. So anyways, label in that diagram, and we're going to talk about everything in more detail coming up. So we'll start with the mouth. The mouth receives the food at the start of the entire digestion process. So teeth are in the mouth. You have 32 teeth. They are comprised of the crown, which is the top layer of enamel. That's the part that you can kind of see, the white part of your teeth, and then the root. So it's the enamel that is coming into contact with food. The teeth are big in mechanical breakdown of food. They tear and grind food, so it's into manageable pieces so that you can swallow it. You don't just swallow an entire apple at once. You take a bite of the apple. Your teeth really tear it, really break it down into kind of a mush, so that you can swallow that easier. The tongue is a very strong muscle that mixes chewed food with saliva to create a bolus. So the bolus is a ball of chewed food and saliva. The tongue then pushes that bolus to the back of the mouth, and it is swallowed. So by the time mechanical digestion has occurred in the mouth, as well as a little bit of chemical digestion, which we're going to talk about right away, you have created a ball of chewed food and saliva, and that is the bolus, and that's what gets swallowed. So we have our salivary glands as well. The salivary glands are located around the mouth, and they produce saliva, which contains salivary amylase. So salivary amylase is an enzyme, or a digestive enzyme, that starts the chemical breakdown of starches. So we know that starch is a type of carbohydrate. So as soon as you put something into your mouth, the starch in that starts to be broken down by salivary amylase. The uvula is an accessory gland and is a small piece of tissue at the back of the mouth that stops food from entering the nasal cavity. You knew that already. So let's look a little bit more at salivary amylase. This is our first digestive enzyme. So chemical digestion begins in the mouth. Salivary amylase acts on starch. So when starch is combined with water, that automatically starts some breakdown of the starch, but with the help of salivary amylase, it completely gets broken down into maltose, okay? So in this reaction, starch plus water, salivary amylase is not a reactant or a product, it is just an enzyme that helps. So starch plus water with the help of salivary amylase creates maltose. So maltose is a breakdown or smaller version of the starch molecule. Maltose is too big to be absorbed into the small intestine and must further be broken down into glucose so that it can be absorbed. So the maltose molecules are too big to be absorbed into the small intestine and later must be broken down into glucose. But that doesn't happen in the mouth. We just have this first step with salivary amylase, and then we'll move on to more digestion of that maltose later. So we'll just talk about the pharynx here quickly. So after the bolus has been created by the tongue, the person swallows it and it enters the pharynx. So the pharynx is known as the throat and is a passage for both food and air, though not at the same time. We have the epiglottis here that we can see. This is the bolus of food, this kind of brownish substance. This was the mouth. So we had the uvula block the nasal cavity, or the nasopharynx, which is what it's labeled as here. So the uvula comes, blocks there. The epiglottis folds up and blocks the larynx and trachea, so no food is getting into the windpipe or into the voice box. So we knew about those, the uvula as well as the epiglottis, from, again, the respiratory unit. And like we talked about, anytime that one of these two, the epiglottis or the uvula, isn't working correctly, that's when you get food going either up your nose. If you laugh really hard, sometimes that happens, and you expel air and you get food up your nose. Or if your epiglottis doesn't quite cover, we watched that video in the respiration unit, that's when you kind of start choking on your food. So the esophagus, that's the next step, and it's a muscular tube that connects the trachea to the stomach. It only opens when it is getting the bolus from the pharynx. So otherwise your esophagus is very collapsed, so it's not taking up a ton of space. Because you're usually breathing, you're not usually eating, so your esophagus kind of folds away so that it's not in the way of breathing, and you don't breathe a whole bunch of air into your stomach. So the esophagus uses contractions, which is called peristalsis, to push food down towards the stomach. So there's a contraction in this area which pushes food down, and each area of the esophagus starts to contract one little bit at a time to push the bolus of food down. And there's a sphincter at the end of the esophagus that allows food to enter the stomach. So again, that sphincter allows the esophagus to open and let food in, and then the sphincter closes that tube. So it's peristalsis that pushes it down all the way into the stomach. And this is kind of a diagram of what peristalsis looks like. So we're actually going to stop there before we get into some chemical digestion of the stomach. So if there's any questions about how the esophagus works with peristalsis, the bolus, anything like that, ask those now. Just send me a message on Edmodo.